After years of anticipation, Cuphead launched on PC and Xbox One at the end of September 2017. People around the world were very excited to enjoy this game's dazzling art style and challenging gameplay, only to complain about it once it officially released. In this video, I will be analyzing the gameplay, the design philosophy, and how it was inspired by the most famous run-and-gun series of all time, Contra, which has gone the way of the dinosaur, with its legacy reduced to mere slot machines as far as Konami is concerned. Although it did not leave us without first setting a standard for how games of the run-and-gun genre should play, this will be the first of a series where I analyze a game that is clearly inspired by Contra and how well it continues the legacy that franchise left in the video game industry. After all, we can no longer rely on the fallen titan to continue it. I will not be focusing too much on the visually appealing art style, for I feel it has been touched on quite enough in the sea of internets. Nor will I be referring to its many fighting game references and homages. Well, except my favorite one.
Get ready to kick butt. Here's a real high-class bout. Here goes.
The wheel of fate is turning. Rebel, one, action!
A great slam and then stop. Now go. Beat 'em up, guys. Triumph or die! This match will get red hot. You're up!
Into the heat of battle. Go for it!
Here comes a spooky punch. And begin!
There. Moving on. I wanted to emphasize on something that feels somewhat overlooked, which is the inspiration behind how the developers designed the game and its bosses. So, for those who didn't play Cuphead, warning, spoilers ahead, I will be looking over the game's campaign from beginning to end. Cuphead starts you off innocently enough with an easy to understand bare-bones tutorial that allows you to take as much time as you need in order to comprehend the controls, rather than a lot of games this day and age that is usually a very stilted, step-by-step dialogue-driven scene. Afterward, you're let out into Inkwell Isle. With few choices to make, you most likely pick the first platforming stage. For those not acclimated to the run-and-gun genre, you might find it surprising how the game simply throws you into what may look like chaos. Enemies coming from the left, the right, even above you, running around like the active hitboxes they are. This could immediately be stress-inducing for the classically gimped.
Watch out for the eggs! Oh my god, Jill! Oh my god! Jill! Save me! How do I... What do I do? Let's just do that. Let's just do that. Let's just... I can't. Damn it. I'm stuck. Too. I'm just poofing you.
Although it doesn't take long to realize the ultimate rule they're trying to teach you, and that is a constant for this entire game. Despite that the objective is to defeat the enemies, you need to pay more attention to where you are. It's not an uncommon rule in video games, but for the side-scrolling shooter genre, it's emphasized most of all. When one is so fixated on beating an enemy that is across the screen, they can forget this rule in an instant, and it can lead to a quick death. Cuphead is no different. It's also worth noting there's absolutely no checkpoints anywhere in the game. 3 hits and it's back to the beginning of the stage or boss. Sounds brutal, huh? Even Contra had checkpoints if you were forced to use a continue. Although it is worth noting the game expects players to defeat each stage and boss in around 2 to 3 minutes, with one particular exception. Even less if you're skilled enough. This is a very important factor to the game's design philosophy, so keep that in mind. Taking 3 hits means you lose. HP is basically your life count for each stage or boss. Dissimilar to Contra, there is no way to regain any HP. Sounds like a nuisance, but the worst case scenario is you lost 2 to 3 minutes of progress. Is that really so bad? As far as run-and-gun console games go, Cuphead is most certainly one of the least punishing titles. Sure, some of these patterns can be tough, but it's all part of the learning process. And, also dissimilar to a lot of Contra titles, the enemies are not extremely varied, nor do they have a long endurance. Memorizing their patterns and understanding how to read their incoming attacks is much more welcoming than particular classic run-and-gun games. You know better, so you'll fight better when you try again. It's all trial and error. Once you got the pattern down, getting that wonderful will prove to be very satisfying. Understanding all this, along with your special attacks and the parry move, you'll be wiping out these big fools in no time. Parries are a very welcoming mechanic to this game, and maybe even the genre itself. Nothing like this has been seen before in the run-and-gun games Cuphead took inspiration from, but it makes perfect sense for a game like this. It rewards pattern memorization as well as quick reaction by filling up your EX meter, although it cannot be exploited, for it is only on particular projectiles and enemies, specifically ones that are pink. A fair balance for this mechanic. I did not witness a lot of previews or trailers when the game was releasing. I initially thought it was one long arcade-esque campaign with a limited number of lives and continues. Can you imagine if all the stages and bosses of Cuphead were part of a long linear campaign? It would be brutal. A lot of players would be unable to endure a game that would be so demanding. Thankfully, Studio MDHR understood that and knew everything had to be separate set pieces of a grand adventure, although they did give the player a taste of what that could have been near the end of the campaign. Besides that, there's the coins you can collect in the hub world and platforming stages. The player can spend these in Pork Rind's shop that give you new weapons and abilities. To my relief, these aren't permanent upgrades or anything like that, just particular perks and weapons that you can swap out between scenarios that are more for experimenting against different bosses and stages. They all have their advantages and drawbacks, except the invisible dash. Seriously, it's practically essential to playing this game. The folks of Inkwell Isle also drop hints about particular secrets that grant you new features when you perform particular tasks. With all this, you have a very gratifying and visually appealing side-scrolling action platformer that's almost as fun to watch as it is to play. Further comparing it to some of the most famous run-and-gun games, it's worth noting several homages and references I caught in this title, both in appearance and design. These instances throughout the game are what I found to be very familiar to particular encounters. It's possible that some of these might just be coincidences, but I feel they are worth noting either way. After all, it's worth emphasizing that Cuphead is much more inspired by titles made exclusively for consoles and not arcade games, like a lot of people seem to think. It doesn't take more than a single glance to see that King Dice's fight is inspired by Black Stage from Gunstar Heroes. The near end of the game even gives you a choice to join the devil and conclude the game early with a bad ending, which is clearly an homage to Contra Hardcore. You also have the option of fighting against the bosses of Inkwell Isle in Simple Mode, which is the game's easiest difficulty setting. However, choosing only this setting throughout the 3 main islands denies the player access to Inkwell Hell, which contains the 2 final bosses of the game. Similar to choosing easy or normal mode in Contra 3, you don't get to fight the final boss's full potential, and you're basically left with a message that says, okay, now play the game as it was meant to be played. Another thing I noticed is the hub world reminds me of those awful overhead stages in Super C. I doubt this was intentional, but can you imagine if they tried to make a few stages like this? Just like in Super C, it would most likely be a waste of time. Speaking of waste of time, for those that do not know, one of the many reasons the game was delayed for so long is because the developers made the decision to take in the loudest consumer requests and add platforming stages. Originally, the game itself was designed to be purely a boss rush, similar to Shadow of the Colossus. In this vast, deserted world, the only beings to fight are these gigantic characters who stop at nothing to defeat you. Well, I guess Cuphead's world isn't that deserted. Regardless, Studio MDHR would end up adding various stages throughout the adventure, as per its high demand. And I think it really shows that this was more of an afterthought than literally anything else this game has to offer. While the stages are somewhat memorable in their own little ways, mostly thanks to the art direction and animation, they feel somewhat uninspired. Almost nothing about most of the level design stands out. It feels more like small courses to help you refine your controlling of the characters. Unlike the challenges in Super Mario Sunshine, which were designed to test your abilities up until that point, these feel like they weren't necessarily created to push your abilities, only to meet a demand from players that expected this to be included in the first place. It really baffled me when reviews and criticism arriving post-launch were saying they wish there were more platforming stages rather than bosses. The real meat and potatoes of the game are the bosses. Every single encounter is incredible and captivating as the last. Each stage takes roughly 2 to 3 minutes to complete, and the boss encounters are no longer than the bosses of later Contra games. Again, just a few minutes for its entire encounter. Every stage and every encounter is a separate mission found throughout the hub world. Compare this to Contra, where the entire campaign is a single playthrough. It's one-hit deaths and limited life count with the opportunity to earn more along the way, if you play well enough. There's also the limited number of continues to consider. Cuphead does the complete opposite. 3 hit points, which is basically 3 lives, and no sort of opportunity to regain health, outside of the extensive King Dice fight, and co-op mode, which gives the players a chance to revive one another when necessary. Also, no checkpoints in stages or bosses. Can you imagine if Contra was designed like this? Or if Cuphead was an entire single campaign? It would take a long time for even some of the best run-and-gun players to finish the campaign, never mind your average Joe. I did notice throughout this boss lineup that there's definitely inspiration behind their patterns and setups, although a lot of it seems more elaborate and tougher to master. This is most likely due to the fact that you have an unlimited amount of retries to defeat the boss. It really concentrates on making the player learn the patterns and understand the bosses. In a strange way, this game feels more like a boot camp of the run and gun genre. It forces you to refine your reactions and dividing your attention evenly to defeat each obstacle. So, looking at Cuphead as a successor to the Contra legacy, I think it carries on the spirit gracefully, but without feeling like a blatant copy. Its ambitious design and structure prove to be more welcoming to players rather than the typical linear adventure and life system people would have expected back in the 90s. My lone complaint is that they did not include an ability to lock the weapon angle while still being able to move, which first appeared in Contra Shattered Soldier. Perhaps the developers decided against including the ability, for it would make a lot of these bosses too easy to defeat. Ultimately, the exclusion of this did not take a noticeable amount away from this incredible experience. The universal praise this game has received almost brings me to tears. Seeing the demand for a game as wonderfully challenging as Contra dwindle over the years to the point where it also became an effortless mess, broke my heart back in 2011. The gaming community was coerced into a game like Cuphead thanks to its art style, not realizing what they were getting themselves into. Sure, you got a few screwballs that think a challenging game like this receiving praise is a bad thing for the industry. Regardless, folks seem to appreciate what this game had to dish out, besides its lovely visuals. This is the kind of game a game community needs to embrace and encourage. Indie developers tend to get a lot of flack because of how often games of that background feel very effortless and cheaply made. That isn't always the case, of course, but I do think it has become a noticeable issue over the years, especially near the end of the 7th generation. Cuphead took more than 5 years to make, and it really shows. I'm not saying indie games need an exorbitant amount of time and money spent to be as appealing as this. Still, I think it goes to show how positively people respond when a game looks visually appealing and not a pixelated mess or yet another first-person walking simulator. Sorry, we're getting too off topic, back to Cuphead. Among the praise, a lot of people also talked about how the game is super hard and unforgiving. I don't entirely agree, but I understand the notion. When you just can't get the hang of that certain boss pattern, it'll seem like a very frustrating experience. You need to take into account that constantly making these errors and dying against the bosses doesn't detract you from the progress you've made, which would have been the case for classic titles. With that said, I think Cuphead strikes a perfect balance between leniency and challenge. Dying a billion times doesn't mean you have to start over from the beginning of the game, but it pulls no punches once you dive into the fight. For those watching, if you beat Cuphead from beginning to end on regular difficulty, if you manage to master the boss patterns and understand how to read their attacks, if you faced and conquered the hardships of this ruthlessly trial and error based gameplay, you have just finished boot camp. You're all trained up and ready for the war that is Contra. Thanks for watching.